In preparation for this, I have to confess that last night I was looking for a phrase from the Bible, the sun stood still. And I was thinking to myself that over 50 years of covering the Cold War, there were two moments when, for me, the sun stood still. One was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the other was the news of a peaceful reunification of Germany in the heart of Europe. Quite extraordinary event, and indeed the sun stood still. And I'm wondering if it did for you as well, General Scowcroft, at that time.
Yes, I think so. What we celebrate now is the fall of the wall in Berlin as the epical event. That was just one day in a period of about a year where we went from a fixed world that we had all grown up and known,
Absolutely,
forward to a very new world that none of us knew exactly was going to take shape, and if so, how. So no question about it.
And Roz, your view as well? Surprise?
Absolutely surprise. And I had already left government. I was an outside observer, but nevertheless was thrilled with the fall of the wall, having lived behind it for a number of years and having perhaps an emotional appreciation of what it meant that was larger than others might have had.
What do you think was the major reason why the wall fell?
There were several steps to it. Some you can look at academically. Gorbachev had some years before, 2 or 3 years before, made a statement that made clear the Soviet Union was not prepared to have a Czechoslovakia in the German Democratic Republic. There was an increasing pressure from the East German population to move, to travel to the West, and a willingness, as we all know, on the part of Hungarians and Austrians to let their borders be more loose than they had been. But at the end of the day, for me, the event that I find most thrilling, even today still brings tears to my eyes, was the march of East Germans in Leipzig, with candles, tens of thousands, daring the Soviet Union to bring out its troops. They did not. And with that, it was very clear that the wall was the next thing to fall.
Brent, of course, that was a very crucial element. In fact, what would Gorbachev, as leader of the Soviet Union, do when he began to see the disintegration of his empire? Would he, and what was the view of the White House? Did you really have a feeling that this was a man who might use military force to stop it?
Well, when the Bush administration came into office, there was a lot of ferment in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, Hungary, and we thought that this was another episode which had begun in East Berlin in 53, Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, each one smashed by the Soviet Union. We wanted to try to avoid that this time. So our calculation was to support this emerging fervor, but at a level underneath that would cause a reaction by the Soviet Union. Now the problem was we didn't know what that level was, but we tried to keep it moderate, and we tried to keep our actions so it didn't inflame the kinds of things like Leipzig, which was obvious and critical, but worried us a little. To me, the crucial step was the 40th anniversary of East Germany, when Gorbachev went there. And Honecker was one of the last holdouts. He and Ceausescu were the last really, really bad holdouts. And we thought, what is Gorbachev going to do? Is he going to put his arms around Honecker, reinforce him, keep him in office, or is he going to step away from him? He didn't do either one. But the fact that he didn't embrace him, I think, started the Leipzig thing. And that became overwhelming for the East Germans. They had to open the wall.
But it must have been an incredibly difficult decision on President Bush's part to trust Gorbachev not to use force.
Well, trust is not the right word.
Well, it comes from the Reagan era.
You know, in the early days of 1989, Gorbachev was actually an ally of ours. He was having trouble within his own party getting some of the reforms he wanted. He was not a Democrat, but he wanted to improve the efficiency of the Soviet industrial machine. And so removing some of the harshest measures was a way to do that. So he was encouraging liberalism in Eastern Europe until the wall came down. So he was actually on our side in a way, but we didn't know how much. And what we didn't want is either a Soviet crackdown on Eastern Europe or a coup against Gorbachev.
Brent, was it not the case that by the time that the wall looked like it might crumble, the Bush administration had re-engaged Gorbachev in a dialogue? So that while trust may not be the word, there was, I'm sure, a picking up of the candid discussion of interests in this region that we had with the Soviet Union. There was a bit of a stand down as the new administration took a look at where it was and how it wanted to proceed, and had engaged very carefully with allies, as I recall, through the NATO councils, as to what might be the progress of resumed U.S.-Soviet dialogue. So that there may not have been trust, but I'm sure there was an open channel and a candid channel of discussion with dialogue. And then if you're a professional in this business, you have to make those judgment calls.
Yeah, but Reagan always said, trust and verify at the same time. And my recollection of that period was that not all of your colleagues in the Bush administration were prepared to give Gorbachev the benefit of the doubt. That there were, among the close-in advisors to President Bush, those who were saying, why should we trust these people? Why go this far in trying to embrace, or not quite embrace, but give this benefit of the doubt to the Soviet leader? He remained a Soviet leader. You weren't sure, really, given what had happened earlier in a number of places, whether force would be used. And so were you preparing at one and the same time for the use of force and Gorbachev reaching out to you as you reached out to him?
History always looks so tidy when you look back on it.
Right.
We didn't know what was going on fundamentally. There was this...
Going on in the Kremlin.
In the Kremlin, yes. Was the Soviet Union collapsing? I was raised and educated and everything. The Soviet Union was a fixed part of the environment. But what we were...
But your ambassador to Moscow then was alerting you to very serious internal disagreements.
No question about that. They had internal problems before. And we were a new administration, and the one thing we decided was that the Cold War was not over when we came into office, as a lot of people said. Cold War wasn't over for one simple reason. First, Gorbachev was a different kind of a person. His rhetoric was great. But the edifice of the Cold War, the division of Germany, the split of Europe, was still there. The Soviet troops were still there. There was nothing on the ground that indicated anything other than the rhetoric was in. And me, who was back the days when you were a reporter with détente,
right.
I thought, we're going to get lulled again by a sweet-talking Gorbachev, and we will let our guard down, and he will revivify the Soviet Union, and we'll be back in bad shape. So I was a skeptic. There were others in the administration, as you say, there was a wide range who were not skeptics. But what we decided was we had to get Gorbachev to prove his rhetoric by facts on the ground. And so that was really our strategy.
Roz, help us understand what was going on in Eastern Europe at this time in preparation for the reunification of Germany. Were people thinking about that? Were there activities leading to this historic result?
I'd like to be able to say yes, but I have to say no. I think we were all surprised at the unfolding of events in 89, 90, and 91. Even as the wall fell, we became surprised at the ability of diplomacy to produce in 1990 the reunification of Germany, and by 1991 the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I think people were so breathless by the end of 1991 that thinking of what the new institutions might be, the new relationships might be, was beyond their capability at that time. But if you look back, as Brent says, and you bring some order to what was basically a rather disordered a moment, yes, the pieces were there, the Polish situation, the Hungarian situation, what was happening in Czechoslovakia, and when the moment came when we were all intellectually able to grasp what had in fact happened and that what opportunities were in place, we were then able quickly to proceed, and to do so with Germany taking on a new role as a reunified country, now a leader in what we now called Central Europe. We didn't have a divided Europe. We had Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. We had the nations of Eastern Europe stepping forward to take on their historic personalities and their historic behavior. We had the re-emergence of the captive states of the Baltic, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And so we had this whole panoply of new countries, a new continent. We now had also a Russia beginning to ask itself, what is our role? We had a NATO. If you were in the business of foreign policy at that time, you made a living by going out and talking about whither NATO. You could also go out and ask, where does Europe end if now Germany is reunified and there's a Central and Eastern Europe? And as I had mentioned to you earlier, Marvin, I was traveling at the time for the Atlantic Council, and I had a trip in place to what we now call Central Asia, and I was only prepared to go as far as airlines were flying Western aircraft. And so I was only prepared to go to Turkmenistan with Lufthansa at the time. And the question of where does Europe end was still very popular here in Washington, the Atlantic Council, and other places. And as I flew from Baku in Azerbaijan to Ashgabat in Turkmenistan, that question was very much alive until I landed in Ashgabat, and I said to myself, I think I left Europe somewhere over the Caspian. But that was one of the challenges facing NATO and the dialogue that now went. Do you widen NATO? Do you deepen NATO? What became popularly known as the construction of Europe? And so it took time for us intellectually to catch up with those large questions, because 89, 90, and 91 moved as fast as history is capable of moving.
Let me share with you from a media perspective an insight which for me was so important in understanding the way in which Eastern Europe was changing and how rapidly and how in a revolutionary way. I was in Budapest, and a friend told me that there are small groups of Germans slipping across the border. And they are Germans who were intent on ending up in West Germany. So I got a camera crew, and we went to a small border area, maybe about a 40-minute ride from Budapest north. And I noticed at that time that there were 3 or 4, and then 7 or 8, maybe 10 people cracking through the forest and getting onto a road where we were, the police were, who were following us, and then these people arrived. And it was clear it was not exactly what was supposed to happen. And then a small truck came down the road, stopped, picked up these people, and raced away. The police were more intent on what we were doing than on what these 10 people were doing. But the following day, it was not 10 people, it was more like 30 or 40 people who came across the border. We had cameras, and what we were doing, which was very interesting, we were taking pictures of these people leaving East Germany, intent on going to West Germany. That night, if you watched West German television, or the television in Berlin, you would see what happened that day, that there were East Germans going across the border into West Germany, being picked up there. And what was so important to me as I was observing this was that the police began to build up strength at this unofficial checkpoint. But they did nothing. They looked away as the people crossed the border. And that to me was indicative of something terribly important, that the people in authority were looking the other way. So, I mean, this is just from a reporter's point of view, but I wanted to throw that in as another perspective on the way in which you could have seen indications that appeared small turn out to have historic ramifications, as it were. Let me talk for a sec about, I asked Roz if she could see the buildup from the East, and you were indicating that you had many indications of major change, and you were looking at it from the White House out. What was the first moment? Want to share? You want a double mic?
Well, the other one's not working too well, it's cutting
Oh,
out.
okay,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Mark.
I never knew people couldn't hear me. That's wonderful. My question here is, was there a single moment for you, as there was for me as a reporter, when you knew that this was going to be historic, big, and probably unalterable?
If there was, I don't recall it. It was sort of an unfolding, and we were going from step to step. The first was, as you described, the summer of '89, because East Germans were allowed to take vacations only in Eastern Europe. And so in August, which is the vacation time, they would go out in Eastern Europe, and then some of them started to cross into Austria and West Germany. And the Hungarian police looked the other way for a long while. Then it became a flood, and they were backing up in the embassies in Eastern Europe. And Hungary finally couldn't hide it anymore, and they said, well, the Helsinki Accords mean we have to let people go through the border. So they opened the border. And that was the first major step in this flow. Then they tried to close the border again. So, and the fall of the wall was the final step. They finally decided that, largely because of Leipzig, they couldn't contain this, and they had to take down the wall. But even then, it was unclear whether the wall in Berlin was part of taking the wall down, or whether it was just between East and West Germany.
I think that's an important point, Marvin, because while the fall of the wall was itself just incredibly dramatic, there followed then a period in which there remained two Germanys.
Oh, yeah.
The wall may have come down in Berlin, but there was still a wall dividing the two Germanys, and there was a period of diplomatic discourse which included the prospect of there being two Germanys. And the brilliance of the diplomacy of this period was to incorporate all of these disparate views as to what Germany should look like, and to manage disparate views among the allies, some of whom said, well, we're perfectly content to have the wall come down in Berlin, but we're not so sure that we want a reunified Germany. And it wasn't until the United States took the lead and lived up to promises it had made all through the period of the Cold War that we began to move toward a reunified Germany in this formula of 2 + 4 = 1 that led to the reunification of Germany. But that was a diplomatic stroke that I think not enough people understand.
Well, at that time, if I'm not mistaken, there was also the issue, very, very much of concern to the Russians. Was this reunified Germany going to be hooked in with NATO, floating around on its own in the middle of Europe? And for me, one of the outstanding moments in that administration was when it insisted that the reunified Germany was going to be part of NATO. And for Gorbachev to have accepted that was a huge step forward.
Well, that in itself was
Just 1 second, that mic went off. If you don't mind, Brent, we'll use that. Thank you.
that in itself was a very complicated point. First of all, I didn't think we ought to get out ahead of the Germans in whether there ought to be German unification. And there was a lot of talk from the various West German parties and so on. Some saying, yes, we need to move forward. Some saying, no, we need to be cautious and so on. And nobody outside possibly the United States looked favorably on a unified Germany. Certainly the Soviets didn't. The French didn't. The British didn't. And so this whole movement was very inchoate. And there was one dramatic moment for me that changed it all. When, after President Bush met with Gorbachev at that famous seasick summit in Malta, he went to Europe to explain to NATO what had happened between him and Gorbachev. The night before the NATO meeting, he and Helmut Kohl had dinner. And Helmut Kohl laid out for the first time privately his hopes and his plans for a unified Germany. And we hadn't really talked about it in our inner circle, anything definitively, but we had sort of kept the lid on it. So after Kohl finished his talk, the president looked at him and he said, "I'm with you. Go for it." Just like that. And that's what really started it going. But we faced unified opposition to it. And one of the miracles, I think, was I was afraid of the 2+4. Because three of the four were opposed to German unification. And I thought it was an opportunity for deadlock, and nothing happened. Didn't turn out that way. But it didn't turn out that way because the Soviet Union, the French, and the British never got together on what to do about it. And in the meantime, East Germany was in a period of great ferment. And by then, by the spring of '90, events in East Germany were driving everybody at a pace much faster than diplomacy would have carried it.
It's fascinating to me from a number of different points of view. I wonder if the State Department, left on its own, could have imagined that kind of what I regard as very bold and imaginative kind of diplomacy. It was a stroke. And the U.S. was lucky and the world was lucky to have had, in my judgment, President Bush in office at that time to make that kind of decision. Because it doesn't flow that a bureaucracy or a part of a bureaucracy, such as the State Department, could have also imagined the world in this new, radically different way. So it's an example, it seems to me a very good example of, in foreign policy, the central role that continues to be played by the White House when it comes to something large, something dramatic. And this was certainly something large and dramatic. And I was just mentioning the role of President Bush. Did you have an occasion, Roz, to talk to Gorbachev, to talk to a number of, like Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, to get a take on this somewhat new breed Soviet official?
Well, it's been hinted at here, so I might as well go ahead and say it. There was a dramatic difference in view between the Reagan administration and the Bush administration about the utility of talking to the Soviet Union. And at the end of the Reagan administration, I think we were prepared to move forward much more quickly than the incoming administration, which, as Brent has said, was full of skeptics and indeed outright critics. I was asked myself at the time, before I decided to retire, whether or not I would not admit that we had pushed too far too fast. I would not admit to that. I did not think we had pushed any farther or faster than Reagan wanted to go or that the administration was capable of handling. But it was a tough go for the incoming administration, even as they began to reach different conclusions, to bring along their own political world, because it was full of skeptics. So I think the state probably was prepared to move faster as a result of its experience under the Reagan administration than was the incoming administration, and was probably waiting to see at what point the new administration would re-engage with Gorbachev and would begin to come to terms with some of these opportunities.
And that was the era, of course, for superpower symmetry, which started in Geneva in '85 or '86 with Gorbachev.
Oh, you're right, '85.
'85, Gorbachev and Reagan. And so when President Bush took over, there was a pattern, there was some knowledge of Gorbachev. But what you were indicating before, Brent, if I read you well, was that there was no way of being absolutely sure what Gorbachev would do, particularly with the use of force on issues such as German reunification, on whether that reunited Germany would be part of NATO. When did you begin to get a feel that you did understand the opposite number, Gorbachev?
It happened only gradually. As I say, when we came in, we wanted to moderate things and be sure that this was for real and not just an attempt to lull us to sleep again. So as soon as we came into office, Gorbachev wanted a summit. And we were saying, no, we don't have our act together. We don't know exactly how we want to do this, how we want it to unfold. If we have a summit now, it will be all talk again, and Gorbachev's very good at it. And we will be lulled into letting our guard down. Let's get going. Then, after a NATO summit in May of 1989, the president made a trip to Poland and Hungary. And one of my chief worries was, having been to Poland with Nixon in 1972, and there was a demonstration. I don't know whether you were on that trip. You remember the demonstration in Warsaw? I mean, it was huge. And I said, you know, that would be a catastrophe, because that could bring about the crackdown that we don't want. So we avoided big public events in Poland just for that purpose. We placed, a president, of course, placed a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is mandatory for every president everywhere he goes. We did it late in the afternoon, just with the president, not anybody else around. So we were very cautious about that. And then we finally agreed we were ready to meet with Gorbachev at Malta, which was a get acquainted meeting.
It was still a very big step at that time.
It was a very big step.
I mean, because both sides were well aware of what was going on all around.
It was a very big step. And it turned out to be very crucial because, as I say, Gorbachev had been very friendly to us up until the wall came down. And I think that really scared him. And he became much more resistant to cooperate after that time.
Roz, what did the State Department, what do you think the government of the United States really knew about what was going on inside the Soviet Union in terms of economic unhappiness, cultural misery, political stirrings? The new kind of Soviet leader, Gorbachev, was singularly different from that group of old men who had led Russia in the early part of the 80s. What did we know? And in other words, do you feel that we were well prepared as a government for what it is that actually happened?
Probably as well prepared as we could have been, given the unfolding of history over 40 or 50 years. I mean, you just can't turn your mindset around and be open to every new thing that comes along. But I think, looking back on it, we were woefully uninformed about the true state of the Soviet economy. We were woefully uninformed about the true state of the Soviet military. I can recall and I accept that in responding to this very visible threat that the Soviet Union represented, one has to not engage on the basis of intentions, which you can only guess at, but on the basis of apparent capabilities. And so the NATO forces, the NATO structure, I believe, was entirely appropriate. But the notion that there would be, for example, a running start push to the channel, we now know they would have run out of gas on the first day and would not have been able to move forward. We simply did not understand the weaknesses of that economy. And in fact, it wasn't until all this unfolded that people understood that the Soviet economy was an oxymoron. And so we did not have at hand either the facts or the instinctive appreciation of what was happening in the Soviet Union. We did have a feeling that Gorbachev was under severe pressure in the Politburo from contending forces and was having to go home and justify things that maybe previous leaders just bullied through, and was beginning to face competition for leadership. So as Brent says, he starts backing off a bit because he has to act on behalf of his own political future at the time. And it was very hard to understand whether this was a change in Soviet objectives or Gorbachev managing of a political situation. It was difficult, almost impossible to see.
Who were the other main characters here? I mean, I've mentioned President Bush, you've mentioned Kohl, Gorbachev, obviously. Who were the other major characters, the people that...
How could you forget Margaret Thatcher?
Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, absolutely,
Big
Margaret
time.
Thatcher, who I believe, I didn't hear her say it, but I think she said, I like Germany so much, I think there ought to be two of them.
That's right.
I mean, she was quite definite in her views, and that, as I say, that's part of what worried me. There was no support for unification outside the United States and West Germany.
And even in the United States, one could argue there was at least, I remember, a rather sharp difference of opinion up on the Hill that was expressed concern as to whether the U.S. was moving too fast. And I imagine were it not for, I don't want to be a psychiatrist here, but were it not for the inner self-confidence of someone like President Bush, it probably would not have happened in the way that it was. In other words, there's a moment, we've always talked about this history driven by large forces, or is there a role for individuals? And I think this was an example, very good example, as a matter of fact, where individuals urged history to move in a certain direction. Would you share that?
Oh, absolutely. I'd say that between President Reagan and President Bush, the unfolding of the scene was entirely dependent upon the two of them.
Well, the two of them, and I would
Well, on
argue
the other
what
side,
was
I've got
happening.
Gorbachev, and on the other side, I mean, the willingness finally. I mean, in talking with Gorbachev, you asked if I'd ever spoken with him, and I usually was at the end of the table listening to him, but I could talk to him as we gathered informally after the official dialogue to talk about the shape of the world going forward. And it was very clear from him and from others that when he and Shevardnadze and the rest of the new generation of Soviet leadership came in, you know, they opened up the safe and there was no money in it. And they opened up the secret dialogue and there were no secrets worth having. And so they were willing to engage in informal conversation on the nature of the world, the globalization that was beginning to be apparent in economic and trade relationships. We're skipping this whole topic, and I see that Annette Lantos is here, and you know, I mean, people like Tom Lantos and the others said you cannot forget the human rights dimension of this, and we began to make the argument to Gorbachev, who listened, I believe, that you cannot deny people, and in the course of denying people for religious or ethnic reasons, deny yourself access to the talents that you're going to need going forward as a successful nation in the next century. And he began, I think, to listen to some of this dialogue of what made a responsible nation, a functioning nation, in the next century. It didn't become a part of the official dialogue, but it was part of the dinner conversations, the end of the table, informal conversations. And my own sense, watching, listening, and sometimes adding a comment or two, was some of this thinking was beginning to engage. Were they going to act on it as change Soviet policy? I can't say that. But intellectually, I think he was beginning to see that the Soviet Union, as structured, the policies it had, the economy it had, was going to be coming up very short in the next century if change did not take place.
I think that it's hard to overstate the importance of personality in this whole thing. Take even within Germany, there was Helmut Kohl and Genscher. And Genscher had different ideas. He was the foreign minister, but he was from the Free Democrat Party. And his notion for quite some time was the two Germanys would gradually amalgamate. There would be some loose confederation and then go together, so on. But then the elections in all of Germany in March of that year, I think most everyone else assumed that the Social Democrats would win them because East Germany would vote as close to communist as it could. The Christian Democrats won. So Kohl came up with the idea, no, let's not have the unification of two Germanys, East and West. Just have the East German provinces petition to enter the Bundestag. So there was no unification. There was just Germany reassembling itself, which made a huge difference in the way it all unfolded and maybe the way it came out.
Were there no coal, would there have been reunification?
History never reveals its alternatives. But, you know, recently I've run into a lot of criticism. Well, when you had this opportunity, why didn't you build a different Europe? And, you know, that's a valid comment looking back on it. You know, we sort of reconstructed the old Europe. But the notion of building a new Europe with what we were facing was just incredible. We were trying to build a Europe whole and free. Now that's a gimmicky slogan, but that's basically what we were up to. And any more sweeping, grand scheme for an EU at that time, which would embrace everybody, was just not in the cards.
Roz, a name we haven't mentioned as yet is Shevardnadze, who was the foreign minister. And in Jim Baker's book and his recounting of this period, he gives very high grades to Shevardnadze as somebody who was very much even more advanced than Gorbachev, trying to move away from the past in the Soviet Union and toward some kind of new future. As Brent was saying, nobody could quite see that. But did you get a sense at that time that with Shevardnadze you had something more than just a hope to escape the past?
Certainly, we did in the Reagan years, when the dialogue was first started with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. In fact, one of the mysteries to me is whatever happened to Shevardnadze as he left on a question of principle. He left Gorbachev and said, you know, you're just going the wrong direction. I think, you know, you're beginning to abandon the possibilities of democracy and all of those kinds of things. And went to Georgia, and as a leader in Georgia, somehow or another, the reputation that he had just crumbled. He became a different kind of a leader. I don't know what the pressures were, but it always mystified me as to what had happened at that point. But I think he was prepared to move faster than Gorbachev was, but he didn't have the battle that Gorbachev had with the Politburo and the military leadership and the like. Let me go on to another subject, though, that I think is important. You've mentioned Chancellor Kohl. At the time that people began on the German side, and Chancellor and others, to speak of a reunified Germany, there was always in the future the prospect of an enormous economic burden on West Germany. And I can recall in a meeting with the Chancellor, he talked about the willingness to take on this challenge to rebuild the East, to bring it up to standard. And there were people who said at the time that the East German economy, we're back to what did we know about what was going on in this area, and we knew very little on the economic side. And the feeling was that the East German economy, with the wall and all the division gone, would suffer a shock, would find a new level, and would resume functioning. No one saw the implosion of the East German economy. And I recall in the meeting with Chancellor Kohl, as he spoke of the challenge facing the new German government, it was a prospect of perhaps an investment of $70 billion to restore economic health to East Germany. And I think the last figure I saw was over $1 trillion that it cost the West Germany fundamentally, because that's where the tax money was coming from, to rebuild and restore a total Germany and to rebuild the eastern part. And I think that even then, what happened on the human side perhaps is still going on. Mm-hmm. And speaking of, I mentioned to you, you can have a reunified nation but still have to build a country, something that everybody identifies with. And I think it was very difficult when the division ended to understand that people who for years of the Cold War had spoken of our brothers and sisters on the other side of the wall, when the wall came down, they weren't brothers and sisters at all. They were at best second cousins. They didn't speak the same language, they didn't have the same habits, they didn't have the same appreciation of life choices, and it took an enormous effort, and I think it's still going on, to construct this German nation.
And remarkably, it is a daughter of that East Germany who was currently running the reunited.
Yes.
Germany. Brent, did you have dealings with Shevardnadze? What was your view?
Oh, very much so. In fact, I would say that Shevardnadze was intellectually the heart of the liberalization in the Soviet
Really?
Union. Well, and because we were there when Shevardnadze quit, and Gorbachev was a different person without Shevardnadze at his side.
Interesting.
Much more reluctant to move, much more resistant, much more the old Soviet positions began to emerge. And so I concluded that Shevardnadze was the one on his side that kept pushing him forward.
Well, that was certainly Jim Baker's view. He got on with him.
I think we were unanimous on that. It was noticeable, the difference when he left.
You mentioned earlier, Brent, the criticism that flowed after the reunification of Germany, Germany part of NATO, all of that. When that was over and President Clinton came into office, we had here in Washington dozens of meetings that, what about the new Europe, and what about the new relationship, and what about post-Soviet Union kind of thing. Did we fail somehow in not seeing the full potential of that moment? Did we not take advantage of it in a proper way? What would be your judgment now, kind of looking back?
Well, probably so. But still, we were, what would NATO be? What would be the Soviets' relationship to NATO? That's a dramatic event in itself.
And still going on, that question.
And still going on. But there, when it became obvious that Germany was reunifying, then the question became reunifying neutral, reunifying in NATO, reunifying in the Warsaw Pact, or both. And all of those were discussed. And Gorbachev came to Washington for a summit at the end of May in '89. And we had one of the most surreal meetings
Why?
that I have ever attended, because the president was trying to get Gorbachev to say something about Germany was free to choose, and Gorbachev just wouldn't budge. And so the president finally said, well, do you think the Helsinki Accords give all of the members the right to belong to whatever alliance they want to? And Gorbachev said, yes. And his advisors just erupted in the meeting. And they turned to, I can't remember his name now, to filibuster the meeting. And they went off in a corner of the cabinet room and huddled. And then after a few minutes, they came back and sat down and passed the president notes and asked him again. So he said, so the president asked him again. Well, Gorbachev then tried to filibuster. And he said, no, this is an important issue, and we need to discuss it. I think our foreign ministers ought to take it up. And Shevardnadze said, this is a matter for the heads of state, not the foreign ministers.
Wow.
But Gorbachev never renounced what he had said, and that was the real breakthrough. We didn't press him on it then, but 2 weeks later, he met with Kohl in the Soviet Union, and they agreed that Germany, a unified Germany, could be in NATO.
That's fabulous.
Brent's story reminds me, take me back to your question on bureaucracies, because the first time we met Shevardnadze, which was in 1985 on the 10th anniversary of the signing of the Helsinki Accords, we were meeting in the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Helsinki, and Shevardnadze, in responding to an opening of the dialogue by George Shultz, because it was the U.S. Embassy, and so his host Shultz did the opening thing, and Shevardnadze, without looking at notes or anything, started to respond, and the entire team in the back of the wall started handing him notes, trying to pull him back, and you're sort of getting out of line there, Mr. Minister. I mean, who do you think you are? And that's, you could see this all through this period of the sort of the wall sitters trying to pull their folks back.
Great tension, and it finally erupted in July of
90,
90,
Yeah.
91,
91?
91, I guess, with the coup
Oh,
against,
that's right. That was-
against
yeah.
Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Roz, go back a little bit to this post-Cold War idea and the formation of a new Europe, of a new world,
Yes.
really. You had left the department, you were at the Atlantic Council then, but you were deeply still involved in all this. What was your vision about whether we were aware of the potential of the new time?
Well, I'd like to say that we were, but this was the period of extreme ad hocery, just trying to manage a fast-flowing situation. The new ideas for NATO. What does NATO look like now that it has, at the moment, no eastern border? What do we do with all of these new countries that are emerging? How do we incorporate them? How do we make sure that they don't sort of fall off the cliff in the wrong, into some great damaging of stability on the European continent? And I give a great deal of credit, whether it was ad hoc or not, to the people who are trying to manage both the evolution of NATO to incorporate change and then to return to this topic of the construction of Europe in this circumstance. And you could look at it now and say that NATO is so many things to so many people that it now is not what it could be, and so the potential wasn't realized, or that Europe has drowned itself, choked itself to death on a bureaucracy in Brussels. But I think all of that is generally unfair. I think people did a pretty good job of grasping what elements they could of a rapidly changing situation and addressing the challenge of stability and incorporation of a unified Germany. Brent talked about Europe whole and free, but the real phrase was Europe secure, whole and free, because people had to be confident that these institutions were not going to unleash old competitions and hatreds and challenges. And so
And there was
I think we did
also,
pretty well.
in the United States, there were people who were talking about moving American Western influence toward the borders of the old Soviet Union. And then we got into a problem which exists to this day. And I'm wondering at that time, Brent, because a colleague of yours, whose name I will not at this conference tell you, but he told me at one point, he says, well, hey, when they're down, kick them. I mean, that there was an attitude that the Soviet Union was over. What Russia was not really clear, except it was a mess. And it was trying to do something quite revolutionary, like build a democracy out of very little undercurrent there. What was the temptation to take advantage in that early post-Cold War period of Russian weakness?
Depends who you talk to.
I'm talking to you.
There was some within the Bush administration. There was some. But, we were still on, I think you can hear me? We were still on the course of having a smooth transition here. And we rewrote the NATO Charter in late 90, early 91 to take out the anti-Soviet character of it. One of the big issues was the role of nuclear weapons. Should they say, we will never use nuclear weapons first, or they're weapons of last resort, or so on. So there was a conscious effort on that. But yeah, was there even some talk about, well, wouldn't it be nice if the Soviet Union broke up into its constituent parts? But that was just internal discussion within the administration. What Gorbachev was trying to do is to remake the Soviet Union. And one of his real mistakes, I think, was that he didn't understand nationalism inside the Soviet Union. And what he wanted to do, instead of turning it into this highly centralized country where the states were simply borders and had no jurisdiction, turn it into more of a federation. And what really happened is that, and by that time, the hostility between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, who was president of Russia at that time, Yeltsin figured out he could get rid of Gorbachev by getting rid of the Soviet Union. So Russia opted out, Ukraine eventually opted out, and Belarus. And the three of them said, no, we don't want to do it. So on Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved and Gorbachev was out of a job. And that was Yeltsin. I don't think it was inevitable that the Soviet Union would have dissolved had things worked out a little bit differently.
Fascinating. Roz, we got about 5 minutes left in our meeting here, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the American Foreign Service. And we're discussing a historic period, and I wondered if you could tell us from your perspective, a couple of things. Was the Foreign Service, were they prepared for it, and how are they doing now in this post-Soviet period?
Well, the question, let me take the second question
Go ahead.
first, because how are we doing now in the post-Soviet period is complicated by the fact that it's also post-9/11.
Right.
And so that second decade of the 20 years that we're looking at really has done more to shape what the Foreign Service looks like today than did the first decade. The decade right after I'd say the end of the Cold War in this 89, 90, 91 period, when new countries were emerging and we were moving to establish diplomatic relations with a host of countries that previously had been these buried republics inside the Soviet Union and elsewhere. I traveled in some of those countries at that time, and I met a career Foreign Service that was quite prepared for the task. And I'm going to add something else here that probably is not what one is supposed to say, but in most of the places that I went, I found spouses picking up part of the effort in a way that was vastly unappreciated. I can recall one event in Estonia where a reception was to be held for the government and all of the rest, and the power went out, and the ambassador and his wife were out there in the kitchen trying to make hors d'oeuvres in the dark with candles and the like. You know, she could have said, honey, forget it. But throughout this region, we saw really couples, one Foreign Service person, one spouse. Often the woman was the Foreign Service officer and the husband was in the spouse role, but working as a team in a very, very laudatory fashion to establish some relationships with these new countries and to build something called an embassy and to create an agenda for a dialogue. I mean, I was really very impressed.
Did the State Department have enough money to do all of this in that
Never
period?
has. No,
Never has.
no. This was the age. This was the age of the peace dividend, and so assistance money was disappearing, and to the extent that there was any, they were trying to pour it into Bosnia, because that was, you know, a lot of other things were happening at this time that were very challenging, and so money was moved out of places that looked more stable, and might have private money moving in and off to more challenging areas. Never had enough people. Never had enough money, resources, and in the post 9/11 world, where the demands are even greater, I would say that the shortages are monumental.
I agree.
And I would say that underneath all of this, the Foreign Service itself, which is out there now in remote places doing things that people were never trained to do, but doing them admirably and very bravely, is responding very well. But I doubt very much that it's appreciated.
Secretary Gates said at one point a year or so ago that he would like to take some of the Pentagon budget and give it to the State Department, but I'm told not a penny has been given to it as yet. So that was a nice expression of a nice...
Well,
He doesn't have that authority.
He doesn't have that authority. What is it that the department, the State Department, could do now, I guess, on its own, but it doesn't operate on its own, to improve its situation? Brent, you got a view on that?
Convince the Congress to do what it ought to do, which is not starve the State Department. Most of our problems in the world are going to be dealt with by diplomacy. And it's more important, it's at least as important now as it's ever been. I was going to say more important. I think probably it is. Because the problem, well, we face a myriad of problems around the world. Force is not going to solve most of them. And force creates its own world. It seems easy. Let's cut through all of the stuff and let's just go to the heart of it and clean these guys out. It never works that way. And to starve the institution which is responsible for doing these things through dialogue, through reason, to search for solutions that don't require the blood and treasure, is an extremely important job, and we don't give enough emphasis.
One of the challenges is that the State Department doesn't deal in what I would call measurables. Spending the last 20 years in the business world, people talk about return on total capital, they talk about inventory turnovers and the like, and they can give you any number that you want. Today's paper has Secretary Clinton off to Asia. I would guess it's to a meeting of ASEAN or something of that sort. The task there is not a measurable task.
Yeah.
It's a soft task. It's a convincing task, a persuasion task. It's an atmosphere task. And you go up on the hill and you talk that way and they think you're out of your mind.
I wish that I didn't have to say what I'm about to say, which is that we're out of time. But I close this with an apology to all of you, because there was supposed to be about 10, 15 minutes for you to ask questions. But forgive me, I thought they were so interesting that I just wanted to hear them. So thank them very, very much. Thank you, Paul. And,
I feel I should stand up. It's a little, intimidating to be sitting in this seat after Marvin Kalb. I can certainly never replicate that. Fortunately, my role here is nothing like that. I'm really just here basically to start opening the floor to questions. I know many of you in the audience, lived through these times from your own perspective. So I want to open the floor to questions. Please just identify yourself and say what you were doing or where you were at the time. So Ambassador Beecroft, Bob.
Robert Beecroft, former First Secretary for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Bonn, just before the storm broke, and now back in the Department of State as Inspector of the European Bureau. I'd be interested to hear a little bit about, if there was a role, the French role. You talked about Margaret Thatcher. Mitterrand was no more excited about reunification of Germany than the British were. Did the French have any impact on views? Was there any taking into consideration what they were talking about, because they were not at all enthusiastic?
Well, they were not enthusiastic. And Mitterrand was reluctant, but it did not, none of this lack of enthusiasm generated active disagreement. And the tactical 2+4 was allowed to operate. My fears turned out to be unfounded. They could have made enormous trouble on all of the four-power issues that had to be resolved. It never happened, and I've not looked into it deeply. I just count my blessings. Don't have an answer.
Dick?
I was wondering if there were commitments made to Russia about how far NATO would extend eastward during this period, which might now be considered not to have been kept.
That is a complicated question. When the issue of Germany in NATO, a unified Germany, came up, what was the proposal? Well, one of them was West Germany's in NATO, East Germany isn't. That didn't work. What we actually agreed upon was Germany as a whole would be in NATO. NATO troops would not be in East Germany. Now, that was technically, I believe, the way it left. Now, the Russians were listening to a lot of people talking in various ways. They interpreted it, according to what they say now, that NATO would not move an inch forward. At this time, we didn't have any notion about expanding NATO itself. There was a lot of discussion about former members of the Warsaw Pact having delegations come and learn about NATO, or maybe having some representation there. It went no farther than that. The notion of actually expanding NATO itself to the east, I don't remember any discussion within our administration on that.
Ken.
Ken Longmire. I served in Bonn under Martin Hillenbrand and also in Bremen. What is your recollection of U.S. domestic opinion towards German reunification, particularly congressional attitudes? How was the White House and the State Department able to bring Congress along, or did they?
You know, I don't remember. I think, Roz, you probably followed or more. I don't remember having unusual difficulties with Congress. We tried to keep them briefed on what was going on. I don't think we had a congressional problem at that time that I recall.
No, it was after I was gone by then, and
No, but
and
you
I don't
were back,
remember.
You were back
I was in
here
Washington,
doing that.
and I don't remember any emotional discussion on the issue.
Yeah.
Tim?
Timothy Towell, retired Foreign Service officer, colleague and friend of both of everybody up there. Going back to NATO and how is it going to evolve? Is it going to go east? We all studied concepts of capitalist encirclement. Aren't we sort of surprised that there wasn't more pushback and more energy and strength by, let's say, a KGB colonel like Putin pushing back at NATO, encircling the former Soviet Union?
Well, you know, there was a coup in 1991 by all the people in the Soviet Union we feared most, and they couldn't even mount a coup against a pretty hapless government. Yeah, I think there was a lot of it. And to me, what you hear from President Putin is this upwelling. You know, when we were flat on our backs, you walked all over us. You took advantage of us. Well, that was not the primary motivation. The primary motivation was, how can we build a Europe whole and free?
You know, there's another aspect that didn't get much coverage in our discussion, but Tim, it's a little hard to be pushing back on the political side when you're trying to increase the foreign investment in your country. And very clearly, as the leadership took control of what was an economically devastated country after all of these decades of mismanagement, they needed outside capital. And you have to create an atmosphere that seems positive for outside capital, and it doesn't fit with pushing back on the political side. So they had somehow to balance this and came out in favor of investment.
That's a very good point.
Katrina Lantos-Sweat, president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. Could you address what we see now as the retreat into renewed authoritarianism in Russia? And you mentioned a moment ago the need for capital during that period of time. We now have a very high-profile trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian billionaire who had built up Yukos Oil, in its final stages unfolding. And, you know, there's a general sense that this is a political prosecution and that you have a predetermined verdict. What are the implications going forward as we see this retreat back towards authoritarianism in Russia, as we see indications that Putin may be angling to return to his former role, and certainly the degradation of rule of law and civil society in Russia in recent years, and specifically from the perspective of human rights, the targeting of human rights activists, the apparent assassinations of numbers of human rights activists, journalists, others, trying to draw attention and underscore some of the very great concerns about what's going on in Russia now.
You know, that's a tough question, because in the old days the answer would have been, well, let's sanction them. Let's have the Jackson-Vanik kind of legislation, and if you don't behave according to our standards, there'll be no investment, there'll be no trade, there'll be no anything of the sort. The place is too big for that. And so you're left with trying to describe in a persuasive way how real countries behave in polite society. And a lot of times the competitions are such that they don't really care. And so what you have to do is keep the torch burning, keep it up front, keep it in the dialogue, don't let it disappear. But I want to make a little footnote to one of the things that you mentioned, in particular, Mr. Khodorkovsky. There's really good evidence throughout Russia and the countries that have emerged from Russia, and indeed in Eastern Europe, Eastern Central Europe, that in the first blush of, let's be capitalist, free market societies, a lot of the wrong people stole the economic health and wealth of the countries, and became, you know, the oligopolies that are so present even today around major industries, and monopolies are not terribly attractive for the future. So in some cases it's get even. The guys who lost out are getting even with the ones who won. In others, and there's no rule of law, it's the rule of an economic jungle. But a lot of these people who are sort of victims of the absence of the rule of law are not terribly attractive folks. And you're kind of torn as to whether you push for them or you push for the more general, like the journalists and the activists and the religious activists who are being persecuted, and kind of concentrate on those and stay away from the economic captains, many of whom, as I say, came to their wealth for a whole lot of unattractive reasons. Not all, but some.
Yes, sir.
Hugh Neighbor, I was working in the American Embassy in Bonn from 88 to 92, political affairs, but there were a lot of people, not just myself. I have a historical question, and this is the perfect way to find out something I've always wondered about. In the spring of 1989, 6 months before the Berlin Wall, Ambassador Vernon Walters and we became convinced that the wall was going to fall that year. And we got that actually printed in the International Herald Tribune. This is pre-internet. In the International Herald Tribune on page 1 above the fold in April of '89. And something I've always wondered was, of course, Walters knew you and would have talked to you. Did he coordinate that with Washington, or did he work anything out with Washington in advance, or were we just doing it on our own? Which
You not
was,
only
from
did
my
it on
perspective,
your own, you
perfect.
shut up every ambassador in the world as a result of it, because the instructions came out, don't any of you ever again say anything that has not been pre-cleared in Washington.
Well, I didn't know there was anything that general, but no, you did it on your own, and this was the time when we were acutely concerned about getting out in front of German opinion. We wanted them to decide what the pace and even what the goal was. So Vernon, who was a dear friend of mine, was on his own.
I'm Bruce Langen. This is a question should be asked by my colleague sitting right next to me here, Ron Newman, former ambassador in Afghanistan. Could you have conceived, in the period you're talking about here, that NATO would be one of our staunchest defenders of our interests in Afghanistan, of all places? Are you surprised by NATO is there?
I must tell you, I'm not. I think I mentioned before. It may have
part
been
of the earlier session.
It may have been ad hocery, but the creativity that was demonstrated in this decade leading up to, let's say, leading up to 9/11, of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership, wider and deeper, of bringing in new members, of working on the issue of out-of-area cooperation and the like, really paved the way for this kind of presence in Afghanistan. I think that it's a credit to the work that went on ahead of time, that when the moment came and it was required, that the institution was able to do it.
I think you raise a great question, and that is NATO today. And NATO is now searching for a new strategic concept, and I think it's kind of critical. You know, it's a wonderful military alliance. It has two parts. First of all, it is the connection between the United States and Europe. There's no other institutional link. But it's also a great military alliance that knows how to fight together. But for what? You know, a conflict on the North German plain is not the most pressing concern of the world today. So what's NATO for? And I think that's a debate which is a very lively one now, and needs everyone's attention.
Could I have Bruce just stand, since this is sort of an informal aside, could I have you stand up again, Bruce, just for a second? Just for the C-SPAN audience and for those in the audience, Ambassador Bruce Langen, we're talking about the 20th anniversary of German reunification here today. The 30th anniversary of the release of the U.S. hostages released from Iran is coming up in January next year. Bruce Langen was the most senior U.S. diplomat held hostage in Iran.
That's right.
And was also the recent lifetime contribution recipient, American Diplomacy APSA's highest award, just received that award over the summer. I just wanted to point that out in case you didn't know that.
I didn't ask you to make that sales pitch. And in a few days is the 31st anniversary of the seizure of my embassy. We don't celebrate that day. We celebrate January 20. In any event, Brent and Roz, I served in Afghanistan in God knows when, ages ago. We couldn't have conceived then that NATO would be part of the scene with us in Afghanistan, of all places.
How about just simply that the United States would be in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Questions?
Hi, I'm Tommy Grant, and I know I'm here because of Rozanne Ridgway, and I'm going to embarrass her. She's godmom to one of my girls. She was my mentor when I first entered the Foreign Service. Should I say how many years ago? And because of you, I'm still at the State Department, not only interested in world affairs, obviously, but women's rights. I'm glad that you mentioned that in your talk about maybe women being underutilized or perhaps underappreciated. And so I'm carrying on the Roz fight long after you have stopped walking those halls. I have to also say I am so glad that you mentioned economics. And that has been, on my side, in my thinking, the probably number one factor in just about everything we do. Why do we embrace democracy? Well, you know, don't you just love the fact that you have the freedom to buy those Lee jeans, buy Blackberries? You know, why do we have these discussions, China, human rights violations sort of maybe wane a little? Because it's economics. And Mr. Scowcroft, you mentioned the EU wasn't even part of your deliberations or your thoughts at the time. But hey, look at them now. I mean, a viable group economically, monetarily. All you have to do is go to Europe and find that your euro is certainly much more attractive than your dollar. Economics, economics. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
I won't do the arithmetic either, Tommy, on how long we've known each other.
Caroline Mears, I was PO in West Berlin from '88 until unification, and then in Mitte after that. Just two things. If my memory serves right, one of the key points that happened on the way to the fall of the wall was when Gorbachev visited Berlin for the 40th anniversary of the GDR. Yeah. And I believe on that occasion he did something along the lines of what you were mentioning, Roz, earlier. basically telling Honecker, I won't use my troops again against your own people to save you. And I think that was absolutely crucial in terms of what happened later and the wall finally going down. Another concern that I have, though, after we got through all of this, unification, everybody's celebrating it, what do? We close the America House. I mean, what are we thinking? This is one of the most important capitals in the world. And then we go and close the heart of our cultural diplomacy. And of course, they closed most of the other America Häuser in Germany as well. I think that's a huge mistake. And when you were mentioning lack of resources, I think pulling USA into the State Department was a huge mistake because this is exactly what happens. We lose resources, we lose programs, we lose positions, and this is the kind of thing that happens. I'd like to see us go forward with a much more aggressive public diplomacy and much better funded one, and see us continuing those ties, because the younger generation was born after World War II. They don't remember what we did. And we need to keep doing some of the things we did then. Thank you.
Look, I can only applaud a statement like that, and in preparing for today and talking with Ian about what would be of interest and all the rest, I had to throw away a lot of notes because I just got so angry as I was writing them. And they were sort of inappropriate, but now that we're informal, let me tell you that you have really, I think, hit a very challenging question, and there are some conflicting interests here. I'm just recently returned from Europe and places where a lot of new embassies are being built, out of town, behind walls, no windows.
Yep.
Diplomacy is outreach. And if you're hidden and it is inconvenient, I'll give you another example that isn't European. If you visit the embassy in Caracas these days, they're up the side of a hill. They've got window slits for windows. But if you're from the old diplomatic world where you go downtown for lunch and have lunch with one of your colleagues, you can't do that anymore. You can't get through town. You're so far out of town that you can't get to these appointments. You can't casually drop in on somebody. They can't casually drop in on you. America houses and libraries have been closed everywhere, if not for lack of money, then for security reasons. And suddenly, all that we have to offer in the way of ideas for this new century, in the way of organizing societies, in the way of outreach and introducing ourselves to the world is hidden and is no longer available, and I think it's outrageous, and I have no idea what to do about it.
I agree.
Yeah, well, here. Okay, well, I think I'm going to have to call this to a close, and thank all of you for some of the comments and questions raised. Certainly that last one, I think, resonates with many of us, and the comments that you just made, Roz. I mean, a discussion that's still out there, very much on AFSA's mind as well, is this whole issue of balance between security and the diplomatic mission. And I think we need to bring that out up front and discuss it much more openly than has been the case, and really revisit it today in the light of current realities, both for the diplomatic mission as well as for the security issues, because the way we've gone has certainly handicapped diplomacy as we know it at its very heart. So again, a big thank you to both you, General Scowcroft, and Ambassador Ridgway.